Real questionable, really quick. That hiccup is questionable, Chuck. That was questionable. Questionable variety. They're very questionable. Questionable looking. Really questionable. Very questionable. Fast food bread is always very questionable. Questionable. There's people walking by that are questionable.
Up to questionable gamers.
And it's questionable. Questionable, but it's questionable. Very questionable on it. Look a little questionable. It's very questionable. Kind of questionable. Questionable aftertaste. A little questionable. Questionable. A really questionable. Questionable. Very questionable. Old and questionable, but still so questionable. Questionable candies. Wow. Questionable. It was pretty questionable. Ah, that looks pretty questionable. Pretty questionable. Looks questionable. I don't know. It's questionable. There might be questionable and pretty questionable. These are questionable. Seaweed is pretty questionable. It's very questionable. That'd be really questionable. I have some questionables. We got a little questionable. Yeah, it's questionable. Questionable. Be questionable. He's questionable.
This is questionable.
This is very really questionable. Looks questionable. A lot of questionable. A little questionable. A little questionable. Is that questionable stuff? Questionable. Questionable.
Questionable.
Pretty questionable. It's questionable. Really questionable. Questionable gamers. Questionable. It's a questionable out. Pretty questionable again. Kind of questionable. Unquestionable gamers.
The unquestionable.
It's pretty questionable. Kind of questionable. It's questionable. It smells questionable. Questionable?
Look questionable.
Or it's questionable. Just a little bit questionable.
Questionable?
Well, it's questionable.
A little questionable. It's pretty questionable. It gets a little questionable, but